Welcome to Module 8 on change. In this module, we'll start by discussing the evolution of sex, and then we'll look at the emergence of relationships based in love and romance. And then finally, we'll end with looking at marriage, which actually goes into several different directions and discussions, which won't be covered in this video, but will be covered in the module. So the Puritans put the pure in Puritan, and I don't want my approach to this conversation using humor to undermine the fact that the Puritans and colonizers from Europe had a long-lasting effect and legacy on the Americas, as well as, the rest of the world globally. And that they caused genocides that weren't only physical, but also cultural. And one example of cultural genocide we can see here is in how their presence and their influence and assimilation impacted the sexual activity and acceptance of sex among Native and Indigenous Americans, among others. So some of the activities that they forbade, and there were a lot, were for external relationships when it came to marriage. So relationships that were outside of marriage. And there's even forbidden activity within a marriage. Okay. So externally speaking, they forbade premarital sex. So sex before marriage. They forbade extramarital sex, which meant sex outside of a marriage, so adultery, or even participating in agreed upon relationships was forbidden, and homosexual sex, which of course they viewed as being outside of marriage because they did not approve of same-sex marriage. Within marriage even, or regardless of situation, things like masturbation, oral sex, and anal sex were forbidden as well, even if married. And a really interesting point here is that women were seen to be the more sexual in nature and to have less power over their passions. They even read the story, like the Genesis story of the Bible, as being a commentary on Eve's sexual sin, and suggested that she ate the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, not just because she was curious, not just because she was tempted, but because she couldn't restrain her desire. And so she is representative here of the downfall, the stumbling block, or whatever of men. So if you're wondering why the Puritans had such strong convictions in their belief, I think we're going to be able to answer this by comparing them to their, and I use this term very, very loosely, neighbors that they found in the indigenous spaces that they occupied. So the Puritans didn't keep their prudish nature to themselves. Of course, they just couldn't mind their own business and just follow their own rules. They felt it was their mission to, as always, to save the wretched souls of the savages, of the indigenous North Americans, basically. And they were simply scandalized by the sex lives of indigenous North Americans. So indigenous peoples, although they varied very much, they weren't a monolith. But overall, in general, they were thought to be more permissive when it came to sexual activity altogether. They were more likely than the Puritans, for sure, to accept sex outside of marriage or to practice polygamy. They were a lot more lenient when it came to forming and dissolving unions so mating unions and um, formalized relationships. And they were much more accepting when it came to same gender sex and non-binary gender identities. And one of the key things that made them different was that they weren't concerned about paternity. And when I was saying, like, what made them different from other groups, this was one of the key things that kind of connected all of their beliefs. And that was their focus on paternity. So, why were they focused on paternity, and where did that come from? Two questions to ask yourself. So, for this discussion on paternity, let's follow a little trail of thought to get to the meat of the matter. So, women's sexual freedom, we've talked about quite a bit. We've talked about virginity, virtues, and cultures, and we've talked about honor and all of these different things. And so, the sexual freedom of women has always been a talking point. It's always been a consideration in how our societal structures are set up, unfortunately. And so, in societies in particular that are undergoing social development, as they move from being hunting and gathering and foraging societies into being agrarian societies, and basically agrarian means that they are on the path towards agricultural development, um, you see that there is more and more restriction on women. And why is that? A lot of it is tied to paternity. And here's how. Um, Once a community is able to farm and produce its own sustenance without having to move from place to place, without having to be nomadic, then they can take ownership of land. And so the idea that one can own land is a relatively new concept, given all of the time of human existence. And not just the idea that one could own land, but that one could actually um, produce wealth and have much more available than what they need. And it's not that wealth didn't exist prior to agrarian economies, it's that wealth just wasn't as accessible to everyday people. So wealth becomes more accessible, it's consolidated, and as a result, people start to be concerned with passing it down to their heirs. And so this is where the focus on paternity comes from, because there was no Maury Povich, right? Um, there was no paternity test or DNA test. And so, as people started to get concerned, and by people, I mainly mean men, with passing down their wealth, it was really important to them to make sure that their wives didn't get pregnant by other men, that other men couldn't claim that their heirs were theirs, were someone else's. And so, one of the ways that you could assure that, I guess, or attempt to assure that, would be to limit women's mobility and agency. And so, the restrictions around sex and sexual activity were in part due to a desire to protect one's private property and make sure that it was going to one's heirs. So the white settlers who came from Europe to the Americas in the 17th century in particular were property minded. They were property minded and they were agrarians, and they had some really strong ideas about how sex fit into their social arrangements. And so fast forward to them like coming and settling in the Americas, and in particular in North America, they were really keen on reproduction for the sake of um, not just survival, right? Not just growth, not to only replace um, people, but also as a form of conquest, right? They were the new kids in the land. And despite the fact that they were already killing indigenous peoples with disease and battles and war and so on and so forth, they sought to build their own ranks and numbers as well in order to basically take over. So this is just a really interesting time altogether. We see this reversal of gender roles already, with women being viewed as the ones who were um, more passionate, more sexual. Another reversal is that women in Puritan communities actually were encouraged to divorce their husbands and to go get a new husband if they weren't getting pregnant. So yeah, it gave women some powers that were a bit different. It also took away those powers. Another thing is that it really, the Puritans really wanted to restrict the ability to reproduce and to have legitimate claims on heirs to white people who at the time probably maybe didn't consider themselves to be white in the way that we view the invention of whiteness. But if, in particular, by the time African enslaved people were brought to the Americas, they definitely had that view of whiteness. But anyway, they were using their sexual behaviors also as a way to shape the economy, right? And to further exploit and dehumanize people of color, namely African and Native and Indigenous peoples of the Americas. And so they even limited the idea of purity. Only the Puritans could be pure, right? Because if you think about, in particular, African Americans, who at that time weren't considered to be African Americans, they were basically African enslaved people. They didn't have the right to marry. And so there was no way for them to legitimize their unions or their offspring. And so, no matter what they did, beyond being abstinent altogether, um, they were definitely going to be considered to be, um, sinful or um, dishonorable